As an Egyptologist, I'm always grateful to be invited to transdisciplinary discussions, despite the fact that I feel like my task today, at least partially, is to untangle some of these for you all, a kind of daunting prospect in a way. On the one hand, the purpose of my presentation is to honor Jan Assmann and explore the position that the themes of the Exodus have played within his prolific and diverse scholarship. As a testament both to his transdisciplinary influence and the centrality of the Exodus in his collected works, Assmann was invited to deliver the keynote lecture at the first iteration of this conference here almost 10 years ago, or actually over 10 years ago. Since then, this remarkable scholar has unfortunately passed away, rendering it even more important to honor his legacy and to continue to develop and expand on his ideas. On the other hand, however, I somehow need to accomplish all of this today while also fundamentally disagreeing with many of the central assumptions of his work and some of the ways in which his writings have positioned the Exodus. All this is to say, I'm going to try to tread a very delicate balance today. On top of this, I find myself struggling to explain the exact position that the Exodus occupies in the collected works of Assmann. It is certainly present, but not always consistently. The inconsistent degree of prominence is perhaps not surprising, however, when one takes into account the many discourse communities in which Assmann has situated his scholarship. He, of course, began his career as an Egyptologist, with monographs on Egyptian hymns, such as Der König als Sonnenpriester, but these philological works gradually start to appear alongside other Egyptological books that situate these Egyptian topics within larger themes and global histories. Ma'at, for example, seems at first glance just to be a straightforward study of the Egyptian concept of truth, order, or justice, but on closer inspection, it is really a larger project about concepts of transcendence and righteousness in ancient Egyptian religion. Egyptian solar religion in the New Kingdom, Re, Amun, and the crisis of polytheism, may be a study of Egyptian solar theology, but it also grapples with larger categories of polytheism and monotheism and the circumstances under which one might lead to another. The presence of such themes in these Egyptological works foreshadows a major efflorescence in his scholarship, when it is fair to say he grew beyond the label of Egyptologist. From this point on, one might thus label him as a, quote, recovering Egyptologist, a term which one of my colleagues is fond to use for those who seek to break beyond the boundaries of an often particularist field in order to ask big questions. It is important to note, however, that when addressing larger non-Egyptological audiences, he employs very different language and argumentation styles than he does in his Egyptological publications. His proposed dichotomy of explicit versus implicit theology, found in The Search for God for Ancient Egypt, or The Search for God in Ancient Egypt, for example, has been influential and hotly debated in Egyptology, but there is no comparable framework in his writings that ask bigger questions regarding global history. This can sometimes make it difficult for a single scholar to achieve a comprehensive overview of his work, unless they choose to sit down and read his entire oeuvre, which will take you probably years. Now, it is into this rather complex landscape that we need to situate his work on the Exodus. Even though one might think when they hear the word Exodus that this implies an indexical link with Egyptology, or at least ancient Egyptian evidence, his discussions of the Exodus appear almost entirely in his publications rather about global history. This is because the Exodus for Assmann was not important either as a historical event or even as an origin story for a single people. Instead, he views it as a story, or perhaps even as an extended metaphor, for the origins of all the peoples with whom we live today, and how current ways of thinking and living first came about. In order to understand why he interprets the Exodus in this manner, however, one must move beyond those works that explicitly take the Exodus as their focus and look more generally at patterns in his global scholarship. I would argue that the most consistent, overarching pattern in this regard is the creation of meaning through the juxtaposition of dichotomous cultural categories, though again, these change depending on the time and place. Now, today, for clarity's sake, I have chosen not to review these in a strict chronological order that they appear in his scholarship, but instead to present these to you in what I believe is the best way, the clearest way to explore the similarities between these multiple frameworks before ultimately situating the Exodus, Egypt, and Israel within them. I will then turn more directly to the position of the Exodus to show how it both supports but also critiques these schemata of cultural division. Now, perhaps the most widely known of these cultural schemes is axiality and the distinction between pre-axial and axial cultures. The term did not originate in the work of Assmann, but of course in the work of Karl Jaspers, who identified a specific period in history, approximately 800 to 200 BCE, though plus or minus some hundred years as you'd like, when he claimed that people developed into those with whom we still live today. He called these axial civilizations, and they were our direct intellectual ancestors. Included among their number was Greece, obviously Rome as well, Israel, Iran, Zoroastrian Iran, China, Vedic India, and Christianity, which were all identified as axial, with then Islam added as a secondary breakthrough. These civilizations, he claimed, all share the same characteristics. These include transcendence, the discovery and self-awareness of the individual, the communication of ideas through fundamental texts, for example, the Hebrew Bible or the Vedas, and the historical perception of a rupture from the past. This last point is particularly important. The cultures that came before them, the pre-axial cultures, were distinct and characterized by many of the opposite features. For example, immanence and the focus of the integration of society within the physical world, group over individual identity, and a desire for continuity, repetition, and connection with the past. Once axial thought entered the scene, however, there was no turning back. The revolution was here to stay, and it was unstoppable, the rupture permanent. Both Egypt and the ancient Near East found themselves on the pre-axial side of this culture club. In a special edition of the journal Daedalus, for example, the prominent Assyriologist A. Leo Oppenheim downplayed the role of the intellectual in Mesopotamia and presented such scholars in the negative as failing to live up to their Greek and Jewish counterparts. Now, if there's any Near Eastern studies people in the audience that find that kind of problematic, just read what Momiliano had to say in the same volume about ancient Egyptian evidence. It makes my hair stand up on the back of my neck. But not surprisingly, no Egyptologist was invited to contribute to this journal. The same basic division occupies a central role in Assmann's scholarship, where it is approached from an entirely religious dimension. He divided cultures into what he called primary and secondary religions, with primary standing for pre-axial and secondary representing axial cultures. I hope that you see here on the screen that there is much overlap here with axiality, though the phraseology is slightly different. I want to draw your attention again, however, to the consistent claim that secondary religions do not evolve naturally from primary ones. For secondary religions to exist, there must be a rupture, a revolution away from the traditional cosmic order. Assmann captures this through the opposition of statements natura non facet saltus and cultura facet saltus, very loosely translated from my terrible Latin as nature does not produce leaps or advancements, but only culture does. From this perspective, only secondary religions can operate on nature and do things, while primary religions are only receptive, passive objects connected to the world and caught up in its natural processes. More recently, however, for example, in his keynote address delivered at the first Exodus Conference, Assmann has referred to the same dichotomy not as primary and secondary religions, but as cosmotheism and monotheism. This updated terminology foregrounds to an even greater degree the religio-revolutionary turn from cultures whose primary task was to establish harmony on Earth by integrating society into nature, i.e. the cosmos in this case, and those that strove to transcend, escape, or perhaps even dominate the natural world. And please forgive me here for not listing the differences between cosmotheism and monotheism for you once again. Hopefully you get the point by now. Interestingly, I should note that this scheme in particular has proven useful to multiple scholars and has been adapted into other fields. For example, it has recently become central to studies of sacred kingship, which is itself, once again, becoming interested in global perspectives. And you see this here in the subtitle, Sacred Kingship in World History Between Immanence and Transcendence, using that same kind of duality that Assmann employs. Again, I would suggest that this is likely a testament to the influence of Assmann's work on global history. In the publication of his keynote address that he delivered at the first iteration of this conference, Assmann recounts how the dichotomies of cosmotheism and monotheism, i.e. primary and secondary religions, i.e. pre-axial and axial cultures, were not the original formulation of this division in his thought. Instead, he directs us back to 1997 and his book, Moses the Egyptian, The Memory of Egypt in Western Monotheism, where he refers to the division between Egypt and Israel as the Mosaic distinction. Here he writes, quote, "Historical reality is reduced to a figure of memory which retains just the two of them, Egypt and Israel, as the basic symbol of the Mosaic distinction. Israel embodies truth, Egypt symbolizes darkness and error. Egypt loses its historical reality and is turned into an inverted image of Israel. Israel is the negation of Egypt, and Egypt stands for all that Israel has overcome," end quote. Key to this understanding is the ability of Egypt and Israel to stand as metaphors for all cultures in historical consciousness. In metaphorical Egypt, there was unity of state, nature, and religion, which was an unquestioned part of the social order. In metaphorical Israel, however, the covenant with God in Deuteronomy, and more generally, the individual's direct, unmediated relationship with the divine, rendered such unity problematic and created a strikingly different view of the world, which permitted it to diverge from nature. If Egypt and Israel are central metaphors, then it logically follows that the metaphorical point of their departure, the origin of their separation, was the Exodus itself. In the works of Assmann, the Exodus thus represents the metaphorical revolution from concerns with this world to concerns with the world beyond it, the flight out of Egypt and towards a transcendent vision of the divine. Now, in the first half of my presentation, I have tried to provide an overview of the variety of dichotomies which Assmann has used to situate religious and historical shifts in a global framework, and the importance of the role of the Exodus within this. While the nuances of some of these terms may differ, I think it is fair to say that in general, we are essentially dealing with different words for the same thing, different ways of capturing the same conception of division or distinction. That this general framework has continued to inspire and inform productive scholarship across disciplines is once again a testament to the brilliance and centrality of Assmann's work. Yet, we have now reached the point in my talk where, as promised, I'll attempt to explain why I find personally such methods for understanding and categorizing cultures unsatisfactory, and the price that I believe we may pay for relying on these methods. Rather than try to convince you of this in my own language, however, I'll once again turn to Assmann and allow him to guide us through this critique. A good place to start is again with comments he made in Exodus in Memory, the publication of his keynote lecture at the first iteration of this conference. Recounting the trajectory of his own work, he provides the following insight, quote, "In my book, Moses the Egyptian, which I wrote in California 20 years ago, I tried to define the conceptual core of the Exodus narrative as the Mosaic distinction between true and false religions or true and false gods. This theory has met with much criticism, and I would not hold it any longer. The distinction as such, and as a defining feature of monotheism, still seems to me irrefutable, but I would no longer call it Mosaic," end quote. This change in Assmann's perspective, though admittedly I think somewhat muted here, seems to have been motivated by criticism that he received from scholars in biblical and religious studies, fields with which I am admittedly only tangentially familiar, though thankfully a bit more so after the past few days. On the one hand, some scholars accused his Mosaic distinction of labeling Judaism as intolerant because of its rejection of other religions. In other words, Judaism was singled out as being kind of very intolerant of anything different from it, even though it's just one of many polytheistic or monotheistic religions and a metaphor for them all. On the other hand, however, others accused Assmann of being intolerant against Judaism or monotheism more generally, believing that he was calling for an end to the Mosaic distinction and a return to polytheism and enchantment. This, I think, serves as an example, as often there is truly no winning in academia. This turn away from the Mosaic distinction led Assmann to abandon one key element that accompanied this formulation, the so-called price of monotheism. Now, by this, he means that monotheism and many of its features often come at the price of exceptionalism, the rejection of different modes of thought, and a rupture from the past. To this, I might also add a disconnection from nature or a loss of harmony with nature. According to him, Mosaic cultures thus bring with them greater potential for intolerance, prejudice, and discrimination. He later expanded on these ideas in 2003 in Die mosaische Unterscheidung oder der Preis des Monotheismus, aptly translated into English in 2010 as The Price of Monotheism. There, he explores more expansively the consequences, both positive and negative, of monotheism, more specifically, the consequences of how this conversion to monotheism was and is still remembered. There, he stresses that not only does monotheism require a rupture from other religions, but that there must be some type of trauma that causes it, for example, the Exodus. In other words, the suffering that the Jewish community experiences in the Exodus is in some ways the price of liberation from the mechanisms of the cosmic state. In a curious turn, however, he then goes on to claim that the result of this trauma is not permanent, and that other traumas must reinforce the memory of this initial rupture. And he included among the many traumas experienced by the Jewish community throughout history, for example, the Holocaust. Given this odd connection, I think, perhaps it is not too difficult to see why somehow some began to view these arguments in a somewhat offensive light or problematic light, and then why he then began to abandon specific terminology related to the trauma of the Exodus and the price of monotheism, even though he still maintained the larger analytical framework, as he again admitted in the quote that I showed you a few slides ago. Accordingly, anything resembling the price of monotheism seems quickly to have disappeared from his work soon after the publication of the English edition in 2010. Yet, I think if we look carefully at his writings, we can still detect traces of this price in a much less problematic manner, thankfully, through an occasional complication of the same rigid cultural dichotomies that are often central to his work. Cosmotheism versus monotheism and immanence versus transcendence tend to appear without critique as they are. Perhaps, again, because they are primarily employed in volumes aimed at audiences that take such divisions for granted. Yet, even while the boundaries between categories remain unquestioned, Assmann occasionally complicates the revolutionary movement of thought out of the former and into the latter. For example, he considers Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and Kabbalah as, quote, relapses into cosmotheism. From this perspective, these movements provide further examples that show how the Exodus was incomplete and required occasional renewal, an important characteristic, again, of his price of monotheism. This potential for slips back into the previous state raises the question of whether the transition from cosmotheism to monotheism was as permanent of a rupture from the past as is generally assumed, or whether there is more of a connection and middle ground between the two than is often realized. The question, however, is left implicit in this work on cosmotheism and monotheism. To find a more explicit critique, we need to set these categories aside and turn to Assmann's writings on the oldest of these cultural divisions, axiality. Over the last 30 years or so, the term has seen somewhat of a renaissance, and a number of volumes have appeared which revisit, revise, and expand upon the topic. Perhaps not surprisingly, guess the only Egyptologist that regularly contributes to these volumes, none other than Jan Assmann. When participating in axial discourse, however, he is careful not to adopt the concept uncritically. For example, he voices concern that its initial black and white framework rejected any possible hermeneutic that attempted to bridge the gap between pre-axial and axial worlds. Furthermore, he cautions against the possibility here of a clean rupture with the past, as axial revolutions, he says, did not occur suddenly or cleanly. While he does not spend much time in these contributions grounding these calls for nuance and flexibility in primary sources, it is clear that they come from his extensive knowledge of Egyptian religion, perceptible in his earlier Egyptological publications. Drawing from his work on New Kingdom hymns and prayers, he brings attention to several monuments where private individuals seem to have a direct and personal relationship with Egyptian gods, whom they may even take into their heart. This phenomenon, commonly referred to in Egyptological circles as personal piety, at least in the New Kingdom, shows that individuals could form relationships with divinities outside of state institutions of temple and cult and outside of state control, a relationship supposedly impossible in a pre-axial culture. He also draws from his publications on Ma'at to argue that the secondary development of truth and order, Ma'at, into a goddess rather than a concept complicates the axial distinction. The fact that Ma'at became a goddess shows that moral righteousness, often the purview of divinity in transcendent religions, has become disembodied from the natural world, allowing individuals to directly engage with and appeal to these moral ideals. Based on such evidence, he proposes amending the scheme of axiality into a three-phase model. In this new model, which may look something vaguely like this, but a spectrum, I think, between two poles might also be appropriate, Egypt would lie somewhere in the middle of the divide between pre-axial and axial, between primary and secondary. Such a revision brings with it important new questions and new implications. First, we might ask whether Egypt was unique among pre-axial cultures, whether it was the only one where we find intermediate stages between the previously proposed cultural extremes. Based on Assmann's understanding of Egypt as a metaphor for all pre-axial cultures and the great diversity of global practices everywhere and across time, I'd suspect that the answer is likely no. Egypt is not the only intermediary, but again, I am happy to reserve judgment and leave this to experts in individual fields. Perhaps the next question, and one I do feel comfortable answering today, is whether Assmann's adherence to cultural dichotomies in some works and his complication of them in others reveals a serious inconsistency that would throw many of his conclusions into question. And I would answer this question with a resounding no. As scholars, we must all be permitted to move between discourse communities, ask global questions that may occasionally require some minor oversimplifications, and employ in different interpretive frameworks in different contexts. As another one of my colleagues says, only the best scholars contradict themselves. Yet, these questions should serve as a reminder that we have agency in how we choose to view the past. We can focus on distinction, but where does this ultimately get us? Especially if we only think of humans from ancient worlds as entirely different from those of our own, entirely inaccessible, entirely pre-axial. How are we to understand such cultures on their own terms? If we cannot ever hope to understand some peoples beyond the unavoidable stereotypes of opposites in the past, then what does this say about our ability to understand very different human communities in the present? On the other hand, we may choose to focus on similarity, focusing on highlighting the ways in which even very different groups of human communities have developed similar solutions to different problems. Of course, it may be true that often in our attempt to find similarities, we often wind up, or inevitably wind up, foregrounding other distinctions. But this only reveals an imperative to continuously employ different interpretive lenses. To borrow a term from Assmann once again, and by way of conclusion, we should perhaps move between different constellations of cultures, rather than rename the same constellations over and over again, as new perspectives may help to highlight different groupings, resonances, and ruptures. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that terrific paper. In my interactions with Assmann, I always got the sense that personally he was a cosmotheist himself, and I can prove that by the fact that he wrote his famous book, Moses the Egyptian, while he was living in LA. The floor is open now for some questions. Yes, Thomas.
Thank you so much for this brilliant expose. I must first say I deeply admire Assmann for his life work, and he was, I think, the only scholar in the 20th century who was able to open up Egyptology to the wider world. As you said, as Egyptologists, we live in a bubble, and we really rarely interact with people outside. I see the problem, and I was wondering from your perspective. I'm struggling with the fact that part of the success of Assmann was thinking in those dichotomies, because there were powerful mechanisms of, I think, stirring debate. At the same time, they came at the price of simplification. So personally, I was oftentimes impressed by the power of these distinctions he drew, but the moment you go into the material, you see, well, it's much more complex and actually doesn't work. And I was always puzzled, for example, immanence, transcendence, and Assmann himself certainly was aware that his dichotomies didn't really work. He says himself, like Ramesside times, you have the transcendent, like universal God, etc. So, and you know, it only works if you simplify and if you also see civilizations as blocks that do not really develop. So I'm just wondering, how do you think he, as a person, endured that conflict? And he really didn't articulate that conflict. He must have seen it, that it really doesn't work.
We've run out of time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe it was just a comment.
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, I've never had the pleasure of meeting Assmann, so I can only speculate here. I think that he got around this by participating in multiple discourse communities, by being able to, in a way, code switch when he's talking to some scholars that he knew will find meaning in the dichotomy, and then code switch again when he's talking to, for example, Egyptologists that find meaning in the nuance and find meaning in the flexibility and the blurriness between these categories. So that's my suspicion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good.